Okay, call to order Village of Riverside Planning and Zoning Commission regular meeting for May 25th, 2022. Please call the roll.
Commissioner Miller,
Here.
Commissioner Pelletier,
Here.
Commissioner Hennigan,
Here.
Commissioner Matthews,
Here.
Commissioner Brahm,
Here.
Commissioner Marhol,
Here.
and Chairperson Mateo.
I am here. We have a quorum. Do I have a motion for approving the Planning and Zoning Commission regular meeting minutes from April 27th, 2022?
So moved.
Second?
I second.
Any edits? I have 4, I think.
Okay.
Page 1 of the minutes, that very last paragraph, Village Board update. I think there's a missing word, the pending and text amendment clarification.
Okay.
And then on page 3, under discussion, motion, and recommendation, Commissioner Pelletier seconded it.
Okay.
It's very hard to say. And then on page 5, old business. That first sentence, I thought there were extra words in it. Oh, second sentence.
Okay.
A proposal to create, talk of creating. That just needs to be cleaned up.
Okay.
And then on page 6, the last one at the bottom, again, Commissioner Pelletier seconded the motion just by half a second before Commissioner Miller.
Okay.
Any other changes? Okay.
Can the motioner and seconder acknowledge that those amendments will be incorporated
Yes.
into their motions? Okay.
Okay.
Good with it?
Okay.
Call the roll,
Yes.
please. Please call the roll.
Sorry. Commissioner Marhol,
Aye.
Commissioner Miller,
Yes.
Commissioner Pelletier,
Aye.
Commissioner Hennigan,
Aye.
Commissioner Matthews,
Aye.
Commissioner Brahm,
Aye.
and Chairperson Mateo.
Aye. Motion carries. Do we have any visitors that would like to speak at this point of the meeting? Seeing none, we'll move on to the Village Board update, please.
So at the May 5th board meeting, the Board of Trustees approved the recommendation for 263 Blackhawk for the deck 5 feet from grade. And then another update not related to the Board of Trustees but to Planning and Zoning. We did have adjudication last week regarding gravel driveways. 5 have come into compliance, whether that is by refreshing the gravel that they have on the property or submitted permits, and the rest were either cited or they went to adjudication and were told what they had to do in order to come into compliance. So,
Progress.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to new business, a site plan review for 60 East Quincy. Page 10 of your packet if you're following along digitally. I apologize, my phone, even with nothing on, it reacts to voices. And I had it on silent, so I don't know why you heard that.
Okay. Ready? Okay. Okay. So the property at 60 East Quincy, there is on the tables there is the most recent survey that the petitioner Alan Meltzer provided earlier today for the proposal to convert this current vacant lot at 60 East Quincy into a parking lot for use by residents in nearby homes that they are also purchasing. And the lot size is currently, just to give a brief overview of the survey, it is roughly 5,000 square feet. And The petitioner is proposing to convert this, and as you can see on the eastern side of the property are permeable pavers. The ordinance states that 60% surface coverage is what is allowed for something like this in I believe this is in the R2 zoning district. So roughly 2,000 square feet of the property would need to be some sort of permeable surface, whether it's pavers or some sort of landscaping. The current calculations for this, as you can see in the top left, is about 2,600 square feet. So there will be 10 parking spots in the proposed parking lot. All of them will be permeable pavers. There is landscaping around the perimeter of the property.
Everything's okay. Apologies.
The petitioner will also fence the property along the east, west, and north sides to create screening between, on the north is the BNSF rail line, to the west is an apartment building, and to the east is a residence as well. There are some pictures included on your desk that Ashley took yesterday of the site as it currently is. Currently, it's in between those two, in between the apartment building and the residence. I'm trying to think about something. I had a brain fart. It will be a two-way. It is a two-aisle driveway, so it's 24 feet, which is the required width for this. The drive aisle to the south is also, it's 18 feet is what it has on the survey. I did ask, I did receive a question yesterday regarding the permeable pavers and maintenance to allow them to continue to be permeable for water drainage. I asked the Public Works Director, Dan Tabb, what the village did with the parking lot. It's parking lot number 1 next to the train station. He says that they go twice a year. They go with the street sweeper, they sweep anything up, and they also vacuum any sort of debris with the street sweeper. And if required, they also fill in any spots where there might be, some sort of sand missing in between the pavers, and that allows the parking lot to remain, in good condition and good maintenance. They also look for any sort of weeds, because he stated that once weeds kind of take hold, it's kind of difficult for the village to remove them, and then at that point you have to kind of start over and either remove that section or just remove everything and set everything down again because of that. We also received a question regarding whether or not the engineer had reviewed this yet. They had not, but if it is something that is approved, we would submit it to him to review to ensure that everything in terms of drainage is met before we move ahead with the project. If there's any questions, I can answer those from you.
And in front of us, as a copy, we have Plan B, which
Yes.
is...
Yep, that's the most recent one that the petitioner submitted today.
Do you have a calculation for just the landscape percentage?
I do. I would have to, I believe it is,
It's up to the top.
is it
I mean,
landscape?
We'd
Oh.
have to verify. But
I did the calculations earlier today. I believe it's about 1,300 square feet for just the landscaping.
For just landscape?
Yeah. I might be off by a little bit, but it's around that number.
And can you correct me, my memory, and perhaps an old document? At the apartment building across the way, the spaces we approved were 8 feet wide, correct?
Correct.
And this shows 9.
no, they are 9.
Oh,
should
they
be
are?
9.
Oh, they.
That's the code.
Oh, okay. Then they would be 9. Sorry. They
I
would be the same
understand
dimension.
that code is 9, but we approved 8, correct?
Not the second round, I don't think.
No,
No.
not the second round. No.
They changed them to 9.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's the
Yeah.
correction I needed.
Yes.
Thank you.
Francisco, I think you sent me some responses to some questions, and you said that there are 2 storm drains nearby in
Yes.
this, out on the street? I
Correct,
know
on-
there's one
on
just
Quincy.
to the west, but the other one is,
Just to the east.
Just to the east.
Yeah, so this would be kind of right in the middle of both of those.
And the current curb cut will be eliminated, right?
Correct, I believe so. Yes. Yeah.
so the apron is how wide is the 10 feet? The driveway leading up to the apron, and the apron is,
Is allowed to be up to 18, so it's a 4-foot flare out on each
right,
side.
right, but just the, instead of
Oh.
24 feet or whatever it was before, now it's going to be 10 feet?
Correct, yes.
Okay.
And then there is the Village of Riverside the Parks and Rec building they use a parking lot next door that's similar to this, and that it has, I believe it's roughly the same amount of spots, and it has about a 10-foot entrance into the lot, just to give an idea of what it would look like, and it's also in between the 2 buildings just down the street.
So it's 24 feet between the curb on the west and the start of the pavers, is that right? But then it's 10 feet for the driveway itself as it approaches? It doesn't, the numbers just don't look right to me, but 18 feet? Okay.
The driveway.
Oh, I see.
It's 24, right.
Oh, I see, It says 8, or it says 18? Yeah. Okay.
Where are they looking?
All right. I mean, I don't know if we're in discussion or just asking questions, but I would encourage, if possible, if the village engineer could look at this and see if it would be safe and reasonable to shrink the amount of paved area in the access lane and the driveway even more so, because we're basically talking about sort of like, I mean, there's 10 spots. I'm assuming that well, maybe the petitioner can tell us how much access in and out there's going to be. I'm wondering if it's a bit overly paved for this type of use, and if we could get more green space, landscaped area on this lot. And still have the same 10 spots, 10 parking spots, just have a smaller paved area.
So just in response to that, we certainly can have them, we plan to have the engineer review it from the stormwater and grading perspective. There have been, I was going to say, the code does require for a 2-way drive aisle, there's 24-foot minimum. So
Right.
it would be a matter of shrinking the entryway and then widening that out into that 24 feet kind of drive aisle. So it would gain potentially a couple of feet, a couple square feet to accommodate that, but it's not, I doubt that they would rein in or minimize the minimum width of the 2-lane drive, just for
This
sake of
is-
circulation in the lot, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Right,
But
I
but
understand
the
that there-
entryway, yes.
Right.
That's possible, that it would kind of flare out to,
I just don't think this is going to be something like the Harlem location or or grocery store or something like that, where you're going to likely often have 2 cars opposing each other. And I just think for safety purposes, if we could if the engineer could shrink the space and still allow for 2 cars to safely pass if necessary in a situation. I just don't, for this purpose, for what this use is going to be, I just don't want to have excessive pavement when we could instead have more real permeable area, not just the permeable pavers, which may or may not be truly permeable after a few years of use. That's my suggestion. I would be in favor of granting a variation that allowed for more landscaped area and a narrower drive lane.
Rather than making it like the green parking lot by the post office, which is all pavers. That's not what your suggestion, right?
No, I'm not suggesting that. In fact, a secondary suggestion would be, again, something that I have read about online, is this permeable asphalt or pervious asphalt use instead of, I don't know what the extra cost for that would be, but using that also in this parking lot, which, I don't, maybe the engineer can tell us. It's sort of, this sort of gets the whole impervious memo that you guys have been working on for a while also. If, in fact, pervious asphalt is even better than permeable pavers, I don't know, for allowing water to flow through.
Thoughts on that?
So it's my understanding that what makes any pavement, right, whether it's pavers or pervious concrete or pervious asphalt, what makes it pervious is that it has a reservoir under it, right? So I just want to make sure, or do we have a section of what the pervious pavers are? Like a cross section of what's being excavated, what type of stone is being used under it, and all of that.
I assume that would come out in the permitting process, right?
Yes, it would. So we've been, the discussions with the petitioner have been that with the use of permeable pavers, they would be very similar to what the village has incorporated into our own parking lot, and two different versions we have of recent construction that we could pull from and provide guidance as to what that required base level would be for those pavers. So with the indication on a plan that's indicating a use of permeable pavers approved potentially by this group, that's what we'd have to do. We would have to ensure with an engineer's approval and review that it's in fact permeable with the proper base to accommodate the offset of that area. So with a certain amount of square footage, then we'd incorporate a certain depth of whatever would hold that water. So.
Are there other commissioners that agree with Commissioner Miller and want to go through the variation process?
Actually, yes, I would, and I support Commissioner Miller's commentary on the 24-foot width. I understand that is to code, but this is a residential lot. We can assume that people will probably use their vehicle twice a day, which means 10 spaces, 2 uses per space. People are going to go in and out 20 times a day. There's no need for a freeway-sized aisle. Freeway lanes are 12 foot wide. Excuse me. No one is driving 75 miles an hour in a space in a length of 90 feet. The 24 feet is, in my opinion, excessive in most lots, but certainly for residential use, it's not justified.
I disagree. To me, it's, if everything here comports with the village code, I have no desire to send someone back and then have us do a variation for it. I don't think it's necessary here. I don't think we can assume that people are only going to be in and out twice a day. I would suspect most of us here are probably in and out of our cars more than once or more than twice a day, back and forth. It really doesn't bother me. I think this is the best use of the property for a parking lot. I think it's going to benefit the residents, homeowners or renters or whatever, and I think it's going to benefit. I think it's going to look better than what's there now, and I think it's going to be. I think we have to think about the the convenience factor and the safety for the owners, as well as the aesthetics or the whatever else we're looking at. And again, since it does comport with the code, I have no issue.
Commissioner Hennigan?
I would have some concerns about reducing that 24-foot width simply because I would want to make sure that the parking lot is still usable, that a 16-foot long vehicle can still back out of the space and maneuver around to get in and out of the lots. There's really not a whole lot of wiggle room there to reduce the 24 feet and I think still make it practical. I think the 24-foot width for 90-degree parking is fairly commonplace as a design standard in many communities in addition to Riverside, and I would imagine it's that for a reason.
If I may, I'm less concerned about the 24-foot width and more interested in whether or not there will be any restrictions on the height of the landscaping that is along Quincy, because I'm just thinking about, for safety purposes, just visibility factors. So that's something that perhaps the engineer can consider. But I'm okay as long as everything else comports with code. I'm okay with the layout. I don't know if we're going to have an opportunity to talk to the petitioner at all, but I would add that if bricks will be used, perhaps the petitioner can consider using white bricks to separate the lines rather than painted bricks. But that's.
So it says grass, ground cover. Those circles on the southern end, they're not intended to be trees or bushes? Question mark?
Unclear. I can see, because I know there's a requirement in the ordinance that states what is preferable to plant are in the perimeter. I can double check and see what is allowed for landscaping there.
Could I say something further too?
Okay.
I wanted to I think this plan for the use of this lot is a good plan. I support the fact that making this into a parking lot. I'm simply supporting, more ability for water to flow into a permeable area, truly permeable area. So that's why I just was asking if the engineer could look at this and see what is safe and all the rest. I'm also wondering a little bit about whether we could use do some kind of curb cuts or some kind of, what do you call that? Slanting of the pavement or whatever to allow some water perhaps to go into some of these grassed areas. I don't know if that's going to be possible in such a simple thing, but, so the water is not just either falling on the grass surface or shooting out into the street. That's just something I'm thinking about. Because if there was a house here, there would be downspouts and they would be going into a grassed area and that kind of thing. Whereas here, any water that's flowing from the hardscape is not going to be going into the grassed area. So,
If there's more than 6 inches, it might, but with
Well,
the curb.
It's
Well, and what Commissioner Miller mentions is pretty typical for permeable lots, is that you do have an overflow onto a grassy area. In fact, I think our current commuter lot has that very thing. It just lets the water flow into the grassy area rather than sit on the pavement, and that does not cost really anything in terms of materials. Maybe it's a touch more labor to create a divot in the curb, but that's about it.
and the other thing I just point out is that since the plan here says permeable areas and landscape is 2,600 feet, that's why I asked how much is actually natural space area, because if the natural area is about 1,300 square feet and the lot's 5,000 square feet, I don't think they're getting to the non-impervious surface requirement, so we'd still have to do a variation. Unless we know what credit we're going to be giving for the permeable pavers, which is still something we'd have to think about, and the board would.
So,
Great.
oops, sorry. I was just going to ask, we brought up the variance we would need if we reduced the aisle width. So this is a site plan review. Would we need to go through the full variance process? If we did, would it really be the petitioner that is asking for it, or is it us that's asking for it? Because we're the ones requesting the reduction.
Right, I
in
don't
the
think,
aisle width.
I think the property owner is the one who would have to initiate a variation process. So, I mean, you guys have let them know that you're, so at least some of you are open to that idea if you wanted to go forward, but you can't initiate a variation at the PZC level.
And it can't be, it's not a part of the,
It's not a part of the site
of the
plan
site
review,
plan
right?
review.
It's a
You
separate
can't approve any
process.
kind of,
Correct. So there are some things you can initiate, like text amendments, but a variation, a variation is specific to someone with an interest in the property.
I would just like to, in support of Commissioner Miller's suggestion, I think it is also very common to have a 22-foot drive aisle for parking lots for perpendicular. I've seen that in a lot of ordinances, especially when it's a low volume, higher density. We're not really higher density, but, so I would support at least a reduction to 22 feet. That would get us 2 more feet. I think it would be, better than nothing. Also, with regard to the drainage, I just think, again, agreeing with Commissioner Miller, I think the hardscape, the impervious surface should really flow toward the permeable pavers. And then perhaps the overflow can be through the driveway somehow, if they can, have that be the low point, just rather than having an opening in the curb that goes over to the residential.
Sorry, I should add that when I was thinking of the overflows, I was also thinking that grass area along the east would be a small swale so that it does capture water, and water can sit there for a couple hours and seep out or seep in.
And also, I think with regard to the landscaping, I think if they're trees, they're not as much of a visual barrier. If they're, right, if it's a hedge or something along those lines, bushes, then I think that's a problem. But if we're putting trees in, looks a little too close in spacing for trees. But if they're trees, I think that would be preferable to have trees.
Francisco, in your memo, you mentioned snow removal. Do you know what the current plan is on how to get snow out of there with the 3 sides being fenced?
No, with the previous version, there was some space up to the north, but currently, I'm not 100% sure where the snow removal would go. I think Ashley and I discussed partially to the west, but that is limited in terms of how much you can put there. But that was just something that we discussed, but otherwise I wouldn't have an answer.
Do we have any rule of thumb of like how much snow storage area you need for how much area of pavement?
I don't believe so, no.
No. Yeah, the prior plan, as I think was included in your packet, included no indicated fence line on the rear of the property. It does back to BNSF right-of-way, and so even though there was some green space area indicated there, that was indicated maybe for some snow removal area, the concern was expressed that keeping it on their property would be of a little bit of concern. We want to make sure that that's happening, and so the fence screens the rail line from the parking lot and vice versa. And so the petitioner instead placed quite a bit more area-wise of the landscaping area on that west side. And so it's possible that they could stack some snow along that line, potentially on the other side as well, on the east side. But there allows some area for snow storage.
Are we requiring the fence on the west edge of the property, or is that something the petitioner wanted to install? I think it's supposed to have a 10-foot buffer area.
Is it?
No, buffer?
Yeah,
No.
there's not a required buffer on that edge. There's technically not a required buffer on any of these sides, as it would be in a business district. So we talked before about site plans where the property is located in a business zoning, and they would be required a certain amount of buffer as well as the fencing and screening. And the petitioners provided this at their own, as of their own plan to provide that screening because of the neighboring properties that are residential in nature, even though it's also in a residential district
Right.
zoned.
Well, I was just wondering about that fence, because there is no fence there currently, and there's a driveway to a parking lot there. So if that was impeding something like use of the property for snow removal, disposal, or something, I would think that's a possibility that they could not install that fence and give them more flexibility, that's all. So I was wondering why, if we were requiring that or not.
It's just it's the property line there, and so if they wanted to, store snow along that back line and lose a parking space, potentially that 10th space would kind of be on that, at the edge of their property.
I'm talking about on the west side.
Oh, on the west
The fence
side.
on the west side that's
Yeah.
right next to the other apartment building.
They currently don't have any sort of buffer between there. The adjacent property has asphalt parking drive that goes just right up to the property line there. I'm not sure what I think there had been landscaping at that adjacent property line that was mistakenly removed by the other property as the demo happened. And so I think this is also an effort from the petitioner to provide some screening for that neighbor that has lost that ability on this lot.
So 1095 perimeter parking lot landscaping, does that apply to this site or not?
This property in general has been challenging because it's residentially zoned.
Yes.
The use is permitted by zoning to have an accessory residential lot. There are elements of this that essentially, because of all these questions we have in reviewing what the site plan should look like and how it should be constructed, led us to think that this was the proper airing of the project. We needed the Planning and Zoning Commission to weigh in on how this should be developed because the current code doesn't provide us enough guidance to do that. And so what we've done is sort of taken all of the requirements from the residential zoning that we could, and the petitioner has voluntarily provided a lot of the requirements of a business district standards for parking lots and applied them here. So the buffers, for example, that 5-foot minimum are applied to the site plan as they would be in that section. That pedestrian type of buffer is at a 10-foot, which is, I think, wider than required. And then the other things that we've been talking about as far as the screening and all of that. So it's a really unusual case, and we're trying to identify the best way to apply existing principles in a lot that's, a residentially zoned property next to a business district
Right.
for this sort of use.
Right.
If that helps answer some
I
questions.
guess so, yes. I was just wondering what the
That's my best shot.
requirements were for the, again, how much we have to
Yeah.
grant some kind of, if
Yeah.
it's just that through the site plan process, we approve it and the board approves it, or if we have to go through some kind of variation process in addition to that. I'm not familiar with how much of it is incorporated simply into site plan approval. But I think this looks, again, to me, this
Okay.
looks like a
Okay.
nicely developed proposal.
I'll just respond to the cuts and kind of the design of where water flows. That's absolutely something that we can address with the engineering plan. The petitioner would have to provide that guidance to who would do the engineering for the lot, but certainly staff is open to that sort of creative suggestion.
And as to your last point, so just a reminder that you guys are final authority on site plans, so
Okay.
you have the decision-making power here.
So, to summarize, 3 commissioners are okay with the plan and the impervious surface calculations. All 3 on this side would prefer to have the applicant go through a variation process to reduce the drive aisle.
Yes, to improve the pervious surface, yes. And again, I am in favor of this use, and I think the changed plan is significantly better than the one that was in the original packet. But I think we've talked about pervious and impervious so much, is here's an opportunity to continue to make things better. Sorry if that was too much.
I'm not sure where we are at this point, but I wouldn't feel comfortable voting to approve this without knowing what the engineer has to say about all the, installation of the substrate, et cetera, and what kind of conditions we put on that. I don't know if
Well,
we're at an
that's
approval
just kind of
position
stuff
tonight.
that comes after, though. I mean, you're just looking at, the kind of things that it talks about in the code. Is it, code compliant? Is the circulation work, that kind of stuff? You're not getting into the engineering details. That's for staff, and that comes after.
But at this point, it appears that it doesn't meet the impervious surface, the maximum impervious surface percentage, right?
No,
No, it
really
does.
It does. It does. How much is there? It's a minimum
Of
of 2,000 square feet.
Yep. And it's currently it exceeds the necessary 2,000 square foot.
But that's if we give 100% credit for the permeable pavers?
Correct.
So
And then even if we were to do that, we've had that discussion before, it require proper installation and maintenance of them. So, I don't,
Right, but again, those are engineering and code enforcement issues.
do we
Is-
have a code enforcement for proper maintenance of permeable pavers? Is there a provision in the code that if someone is given 100% credit, then they must agree to maintain?
it would be, so if a project is approved for construction in a particular condition and upon completion of that meets the code, then the expectation would be that it's maintained in that condition, in good working condition, for the, life of that structure or surface or whatever it is that's been constructed. So I would say yes. I mean, we would enforce a property maintenance code applying that. If the concern is about the proportion of permeable surface, I don't know. I know you prefer the grass and some type of planted material, but should the proportion of pavers be modified at all? Is that something you would be open to? The petitioner has the right to determine what they're comfortable with and would do, but I'm just exploring the question if that would alter how you look at the project, and I don't know if it would, because your concern about maintenance continues with use of additional pavers, but just bringing that up.
The maintenance provision should probably be something similar to what we did for gravel driveways, is it should simply be added to our requirements and does not need to be specific to this discussion.
I made a note for our final agenda item.
Can you just refresh my memory? What is the pervious surface requirement for residential?
In this particular district, it's 60% can be covered. So 40% would be impervious. Or, sorry,
Pervious. I have the same problem.
yes,
Yeah, pervious.
exactly. It's been a long day.
So 40%, and really, we're at about 23% of green space, from what I can tell.
23%.
And so to give context to when there is a property in a residential area where they're using pavers that are in fact permeable, then those would count towards their pervious surface calculation. And so we've applied the same here. So really, it's that asphalt section and a little bit of curbing that would be considered impervious according to our current codes.
Yeah, just as a point of reference, I wanted to.
Yes.
You know, point that out, because we are over 50% pervious.
Yes.
If you include the pavers,
If you include the paper.
if you include the pavers.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So if the definition in the code for impervious surface says semi-pervious surface areas, e.g. permeable pavers, may be counted as impervious surface at a reduced rate. So that's what we've been discussing all this time. So roughly, if we're roughly giving them 50% credit for the permeable pavers, which would get them to the 2,000 square foot requirement. And if we're comfortable with that, I won't stand in the way of that. I just want to make sure that's clear to everyone.
Yes, that's the idea.
And then is that going to inform future commitments that the village is going to make in perhaps having impervious, you know, a formula for how we look at different types of pervious surfaces going forward? And that's the memo you're still working on.
That would be the idea, yes, for
Because
future.
if we do that, then pervious, if we give 100% credit to permeable pavers as pervious surface, then someone can pave their entire lot from edge to edge. So that, I think that's a concern. That we don't want to allow that in the future.
Right.
Yeah.
Although when it comes to parking lots, I think we'd still have island requirements and buffer and all that. But maybe someone would argue what you're arguing.
Well, given that, according to staff, all the requirements are met, I'm not inclined to ask the applicant to go through the variation process with that time and expense. Have your opinions changed on that issue? Okay. So the majority are not in favor of asking the petitioner, the applicant, to go through the variation process.
I think we would end up with only, I mean, at my suggesting, would only be another 200 square feet, which is not,
Yeah.
not a lot, and I would prefer not to cause the petitioner to have to go through further.
And the improvements from the first plan to this one were really, really nice, significant, so appreciate the efforts. So anybody willing to make a motion?
Motion to approve the site plan as presented.
Perhaps including suggestions that landscaping plants don't impede vision, don't obstruct vision.
Of course.
And consider slanting toward the pavers. So that's up, those are just conditions to consider, not requirements, right?
We would still apply the visibility requirements of other properties. For instance, a landscaping hedge wouldn't be something that would be permitted anywhere in the residential districts, and so we wouldn't allow that to be landscaped in that way. So I think they're taking some guidance, again, from similar lots in the downtown area, which do have some lower landscaped bushes, but certainly want to make sure pedestrians and vehicles have visibility access.
Is there a second?
I second that motion.
Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Commissioner Marhol,
No.
Commissioner Miller,
Yes.
Commissioner Pelletier,
Yes.
Commissioner Hennigan,
Yes.
Commissioner Matthews.
Yes.
Commissioner Brahm,
Yes.
and Chairperson Mateo.
Yes. Motion carries. Thank you. Moving on to our next agenda item, discussion regarding maximum deck height from grade. Thank you, Mr. Meltzer.
Thank you.
Francisco, I think that's you.
Okay. Okay. So, as some of you may recall, 263 Blackhawk came in for a variation for a deck 5 feet from grade. There was also another variation a few months ago for 490 Uvedale for similar variation for a deck 5 feet from grade. Sorry. And in 2014, there was also another request for a variation for a deck above the maximum height of 4 feet. And I also encountered a property at 310 Maplewood where the certificate of compliance noted that the current deck in the rear of the property exceeded the maximum height of the 4 feet. So we've had a few come in front of Planning and Zoning and the Board of Trustees for decks above 4 feet from grade. And so because of that, staff researched surrounding communities to see what their standards were regarding maximum deck heights, and also trying to figure out why Riverside had this 4-foot height maximum for decks here in town. Some of the nearby communities that I looked into, there's a very simple chart on the back of the memo. Berwyn, LaGrange Park, Westchester, Hinsdale, Oak Park, Elmhurst, Brookfield, and Park Ridge were all communities that I researched and reached out to. And none of those communities have a deck height maximum. They all follow their respective building codes, whatever edition it is that they follow. And so Riverside is one of the kind of outliers in that there is a 4-foot maximum height for something like that for a deck. I also spoke to our building inspector here, Lou, to kind of clarify why maybe Riverside had that. We both kind of figured that maybe at the time that this was implemented, decks were common at 4 feet from grade, or that's just how houses may have been built. It may also just be for a cosmetic reason. Regarding deck construction, he stated, there are no concerns with deck height so long as they follow the building code. So the larger the structure, I think what he said was the members have to meet that requirement. And the building code, I looked into it as well, doesn't have anything regarding deck heights. It treats decks as floors, so as long as it follows the spans for the floor joists and for the beams or for the piers, it would be fine to build kind of however one would want to build. And there was another publication too, the American Wood Council, that also has best practices, I believe is what they call it, for decks. But again, it's based on the building code. So all of these communities and the building code and the American Wood Council all default to a building code as opposed to having some sort of maximum deck height. Trustee Pollock also mentioned at one point that if maybe there should be some consideration to change the language in the ordinance if we have very similar petitions within a short period of time, which we have had. So that is kind of my brief overview about deck heights. The village board requested that that maybe planning and zoning review any sort of language and see if there might be clarification on the language that we have now, or specifically address it to allow homeowners to build a deck that is above that 4-foot grade, to not have to go through that variation process that the 2 properties that we've reviewed in the past few months have had to go through.
Questions? Thoughts?
I personally would be in favor of a text amendment to eliminate or change that requirement. The 4-foot height limit seems, from what I can tell, somewhat arbitrary, and given that we've seen there are numerous houses throughout Riverside who already have decks higher than 4 feet, I don't think that makes a lot of sense to require it at that level. If the concern is out there that we would have 2-story decks going up, we could do something that's tied to the ground floor elevation of the house. But I wouldn't want to see any other specific number necessarily.
I actually agree. I agree with Commissioner Hennigan in that tying it to the first floor elevation is probably the best way to go. One note is that we should not be using 263 Blackhawk as an example because it was clearly approved against the code that was currently in place at the time. I think all the other examples do support what Commissioner Hennigan noted, but 263 is a poor example to be following.
And I wanted to mention the one that you found from 2014 on Maplewood. That was a very unusual circumstance where FEMA had told the homeowner that they could not utilize the first floor of the home anymore. Due to flooding issues, and so they were allowed to build a 3rd story, vacate the 1st story completely, and their existing 2nd story essentially became the 1st story, so we allowed them to have a walkout deck at that location towards the river.
There, in addition to, I'm sorry for interrupting. In addition to what Francisco had listed as some recent projects, there are additional projects that are considering work as well that would encounter similar issues with construction just based on where the joists of their first floor come out into the rear yard. And so we're seeing it more and more as people are, or, you know, yeah, we're just seeing it more and more as we're encountering more deck projects. I'm not sure if it's just the stock of houses that are showing up with an interest in doing work, or if it tends to be something that's either, you know, more recent construction or other styles that are being built. If we have just a blend of, you know, walkout or basement doors that end up conflicting windows at that lower level. Whatever it might be, but having that additional flexibility of height, even if it's, like you say, tied to the ground level story or first floor elevation, certainly is something that we could craft code to address.
Does our code have anything regarding like balconies? For instance, I'm thinking about someone who would have, you know, a master bedroom on the back of their house. If we tie it to the first floor level, they couldn't put a deck there, but could they put a balcony, like a walkout balcony? Obviously, that's very common, but I don't know if Riverside bars that. Does anyone happen to know?
I'm not sure. I'd have to.
I don't know if off the top of our head we can cite that right now, but there was the property at 178 Maplewood that this commission had seen recently where
Yeah.
they did have that upper story and received approval through a variation. I can't recall if the variation was for the purposes of that height, but there was a door there. And so there was a walkout, and there's a couple of houses that you see around Riverside.
Sure,
that
and a
have
number of the
second story.
multifamily as well, the townhomes on Herrick, what is that, Burlington have balconies and,
Right, but those were probably approved a long time ago, and I have no idea if I'm just curious, that's all.
yeah.
If, you know, because you mentioned, Ms. Monroe, that you were seeing more and more deck projects.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering
Yeah.
if that's something also people are trying to do, is expanding their outdoor space on their upper levels.
Not as frequently that we're seeing in the construction phase, but,
Okay.
I mean, I wouldn't say never, but certainly it's something that we see much more from the, you know, we have our kitchen and we want to walk out from the kitchen kind of thing.
Well, I'm in favor of eliminating this 4-foot limitation. I don't know if it's best to just eliminate it, like apparently all these other villages have done. They just don't have any reference, or tying it to some kind of a construction element, you know, of the house, like first floor joists. I have no idea what's better.
Any objections? Any other tweaks?
I would say just at or below the first floor elevation would be adequate.
You can work with that?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll draft an amendment and set up a hearing.
Yeah, great.
Okay. Oh, so Francisco, I had asked you about the building code requirements. Are there any, never mind. I had the question, but now that we're tying it to the first floor, then it's a non-starter. Okay, thank you. Moving on to old business, continuation of discussion on transit-oriented development zoning code update.
Okay, we are almost there. You've made it through 3 meetings now, starting in February of this year, talking about, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, just for the record, note that
Yes.
Todd Nadalak is here, joining our meeting.
Thank you for stopping me. I did plan to introduce Todd. I didn't want to forget. So, yes, joining us by Zoom for the aid of the commission in answering questions. So we're glad to have Todd back with us. Yeah, so my memo for clarification, the packet, we will be amending it, and we'll make sure we do that in the best way possible to update it online for everyone. But the commission received on Monday the complete version of this, the memo. It actually was, for the most part, included in your packet on April 27th, so you have seen the information in there. I believe that it was best to preface this month's meeting with just a very short synopsis of what we had already done and accomplished and where we left off, which was at the use tables in chapter 10.5 and on business districts. That's kind of where our conversation halted at the conclusion of last meeting. And so I just felt it was important to, for the record, provide that context. So we have a couple of sections still to talk about, and if you want to revisit anything from the last conversations, of course, please do. But we've been walking through each of these sections little by little. So we have our, we've got our business district use table as one item. We have some changes to our use standards, which is chapter 6 in the zoning code. We're still talking about off-street parking, so chapter 8 of the zoning code. And I believe that concludes the kind of sections of review that are left. So off-street parking encompasses both some discussion on electric vehicle parking and charging stations, a new section on bicycle parking, and a couple of other adjustments. So I'm happy to just follow along if you have comments, but certainly that's a quick summary of where we left off. So in the memo, the new memo, we started on page 17, which is labeled page 48 of the original memo from the consultant team. It's kind of clipped and inserted with all the red line changes. So it's your 10.5.9 use and bulk requirement tables. And so just determining whether these uses, whether special use are permitted or not at all in those business districts, and including the B1 TOD district, so that's the newly proposed overlay, what you think about each of those. I'll take any comments or questions.
So I think I had commented at the last meeting that the cannabis uses were already in the table.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, you did. We will ensure that stays
And get switched to permitted.
permitted, yes.
So everybody has the table in front of them? So last month, we talked about going against the consultant's recommendation and allowing drive-through facilities in the TOD. Do we want to do that for financial institutions, for example? Or retail with drive-throughs? For consistency?
Chair Mateo, was that a permitted use or a special use for those drive-throughs?
Currently permitted, at least for the
Okay.
financial
For the-
institution.
For the discussion, okay.
Special use for last year. Permitted for, special use for retail sales establishments or restaurants with drive-throughs. Currently, gas stations are allowed in the B1C. Do we want to continue to allow them in the TOD?
Gas stations. My opinion is I don't see how a gas station could be cited in the TOD, so I don't think it matters that much unless the TOD is expanded.
Well, currently, Amstar, Minuteman, whatever it's being called on Quincy, is in the B1C. And if the TOD is approved, it would then be situated in the TOD.
Okay, I stand corrected.
I would
That's
think that we
insane.
would want to allow gas stations in the TOD. Since it's along Harlem, and that's, obviously a heavily traveled arterial.
I didn't hear you. What did you say about gas stations? I'm sorry.
I would be in favor of allowing gas stations in the TOD because the TOD is along Harlem, which is a high-trafficked arterial. So, and it, from the standpoint of, tax income, it's,
Yeah,
And I would agree
that.
with that.
So would that be a special use or permitted use?
Probably remain as a
It's
special use.
currently a special use.
I
In-
wouldn't
in the other.
disagree with that.
Okay.
So what about drive-through facilities? Financial institution, restaurant, retail sales establishments, they're currently special uses in the B1C. If we change a location to, we don't have any that I know of currently.
I would think for the same reason they should be special use, because you're having a lot of car traffic and you'd want to have some ability to look at what is proposed.
Right now, those uses are blank, and so we would be continuing the use.
Yes.
We don't have
Right.
to.
So it's not in existence anymore, but, I mean, there was a dry cleaner, I think,
Right.
along Harlem, and that was a drive-through facility example along Harlem. That would be retail, I guess, in nature, service-oriented, and not necessarily a restaurant or bank.
So the question on the table is whether or not we should allow drive-through banks and drive-through retail establishments in the TOD as a special use or permitted use? Is that the question, or not at all?
We can leave it blank, in which case they are not allowed under any circumstance, or we can add S's to them so that they would be special uses and continue in the spirit that we had before.
And restaurants was the third category.
I would be okay with extending it to a special use in the TOD.
Okay? Any objections? What about animal shelters? So by way of background, the ferret rescue on Ogden wanted to move to Harlem, and so we went through the process of approving an animal shelter on Harlem, and then they stayed where they are. Do we want to allow animal shelters permitted or as a special use in a new TOD?
I'd be okay with that as a special use.
Just to be clear, the special use, what is that, what are the requirements for approving a special use?
So it's something that you are generally okay with, but because of the specific impacts it may have at a particular location, you want to look at them on a case-by-case basis. So you're looking at the standards involve, the effect on the immediate area, light, traffic, that kind of thing. What are the other standards?
Well, as long, that's.
Just
that's
looking to
fine.
make
That's
sure,
all I wanted to know.
just making sure it fits in where it's
You don't
where it's
want one
proposed to
going
go.
next, I wouldn't want an animal shelter, next to like one of the residences.
Right.
But in a more built-up area next to a gas station, I don't particularly care. Next to the railroad is whatever, it's different.
But is the purpose of having the TOD, it's to encourage transit-oriented development? And we have a fairly small area, so we want like people living there and doing business there. And we were talking about what kind of, like lots of offices, like medical offices, don't have sufficient foot traffic. We don't want to allow those. So I'm not sure that we should be allowing animal shelters. There's nothing wrong with animal shelters, but I would think for the TOD, we want to focus on other types of uses.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
And it's not
Although
sales tax generating.
That's true, that's true,
Yeah.
that's true.
Right, so that's certainly a reasonable basis on which to, the idea of the TOD is a reasonable basis to distinguish the shelters if you wanted to.
So leave that blank for TOD shelters?
Yeah.
Okay. Since we are going to have a more thorough discussion of assisted living, community residences, independent living, do we want to make any changes to what we'll have a public hearing on? Keep it as is, or make changes to whether things are permitted or special in various districts? Right now, I'm looking at page 51 of the document.
And to clarify that, page 51 is talking about the B2 districts, where B1, those uses proposed match the existing allowed uses. So it would be special use throughout each of the 3 districts for both assisted living and independent living. And then the B2 varies slightly just based on our past discussion and future discussion potentially on them, correct? Okay.
I think I made this comment at the last meeting too, but on page 50 about the places of worship, that, I would be concerned with breaking those out as their own use. I think they should stay under places of assembly.
So we just need to remove that line
Yes.
underneath. Okay. Yeah, this, as I said, these are reused pages from the last meeting, so we haven't had a chance to adopt any changes yet. I think the consultant is working with us and will provide the proper text in the ordinance for text amendment.
Even though we have separate definitions for assembly and worship,
Was it the worship, was that a new proposed definition?
I can't keep track.
But I think the existing definition for places of assembly mentioned places of worship. So they would they may be treated for like some purpose separately, but in terms of uses, I think they should fall under places of assembly. But we'll look at that and make sure it all
Okay.
fits together.
And cannabis is being removed from B2, right?
Yes. Right, so just to jump back to your point, so on the place of worship, it's defined in the non-use section. And then if you go to the uses under place of assembly, it says it includes places of worship.
Okay.
So it's already covered.
Great, thank you. And then the footnote for the table, we've removed. We're going to remove, right? Footnote 2? Okay. Other comments on 1059?
Which footnote?
The one about schools and churches having different requirements,
Okay.
greater level of review.
Is that what you're looking at?
Yes.
So you're referring to page 59? Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the district bulk requirements tables. We had agreed the commission had agreed to remove that. And as part of that, we put on our list to revisit the special use standards by which we could address the concerns that might come up that would be addressed by this footnote.
What's next?
Did we talk about the bulk requirements themselves? So building height and massing. So here is the the highlights. We're looking at that minimum building height, which in the residential district, I think we also established. The maximum building heights are defined. They're slightly modified. I think we did talk through these and address some of these questions. And then the B1 TOD, the new district would have a maximum building height of 60 feet, but no more than 5 stories. I think we had questions about at what point grade would be measured and, to make sure they hit that either at the height measurement of feet or by story. And then, of course, the setbacks and various encroachments allowed.
On maximum front yard, pages 55 and 56, the language at the bottom that says to be determined by the Planning and Zoning Commission on a case-by-case basis, I wasn't understanding that. Is that out?
I think we decided to remove that.
Okay.
I thought that the last meeting had concluded with us removing that item there.
Okay. Yeah, I couldn't find,
Okay.
for tonight, the notes from the
Yeah.
last one, so.
No, that'll be reflected in the new proposed language.
I also had a comment on that same section. I don't understand why we need to have all that extra verbiage, the A, B, C, and D in the zoning code. I mean, it seems like a lot, and a lot of, very wordy restrictions. I don't even know if they're appropriate for a zoning code.
Todd, could you maybe comment as to why those items would be included in that, the bulk requirements tables? A, B, C, D in the maximum front yard section?
Sure. That was from my notes and from my recollection. Some of that was taken from our discussion as a committee, base standards, which was bullet point B, and then I think bullet point C was also raised in our steering committee about making sure that the additional 5 feet was contiguous. There wasn't, so that it was like 3 feet here, another foot there and there, not piecemeal, but contiguous 5 feet. And then the bullet point D, I believe also came from our discussion about making sure that it was the most minimal distance so that you weren't really extending it, like doing a long winding path from the store and restaurant entrance to the furthest point of the dining area. I believe all of that came up in our discussion, and I think that's why we included it. We don't necessarily have to have it in there, but I just included it in there because during the review process or the revision process, we often put in more than what's needed. And then like what we're doing now is the point where the PZC can chime in and say, yeah, we agree, but maybe it's not necessary to have within the text, or maybe it's a footnote or an endnote. So those discussions are fair. And I think it's up to you all if you want to keep all 4 bullet points or keep some of them or remove all of them. It's all up to you. We included it just because that was just part of our discussion, and it helps clarify why we came up with the amended text. So in some way, it's a guidepost for us to understand why we made the change, but remove it, we can.
Even if those A, B, C, and D are removed from this section, I would think we would still want to have them somewhere in the zoning ordinance so that we're still regulating the outdoor dining's location in some manner.
I was actually I was looking through to find a good place for it, and I think it might be appropriate in 10.5.5, talking about bulk requirements when we have things like there's a bulk table that's referenced, buildings built to both interior side lot lines and kind of a little description of that, parking access requirements, design standards. So I think inserting something about, the restaurants that are offering outdoor dining could potentially fit in that section unless legal would find a better place for that.
Yeah, the other option might be 10.6.2G, the use standards for restaurants with outdoor cafes.
Okay. Another good one.
To that point, I don't think we need to reiterate ADA. That's required no matter what. That's a non-starter.
Yeah, I agree.
To have ADA.
Yeah.
I think what the consultant noted for item C is, it says is contiguous to, but is the goal to simply have a consistent distance across the entire front of the property that extra is used for, so that you don't have a bunch of in and outs? I guess I'm not quite following the use of the word contiguous.
Contiguous is so that contiguous to the initial 5 feet was meant so that it wasn't 5 feet here, and then if a petitioner wanted an extra 5 feet, but they wanted it elsewhere on their site, it had to be contiguous to an original 5 feet, so that it was 10 feet contiguous versus 5 feet and then a gap and then 5 feet. So that was the reason why it was written there. The voice was a little staticky, so I may have missed another part of your question.
No, I don't think you missed.
So hopefully that.
You didn't miss anything, I guess. Is there a better way to word this?
I personally, I can't visualize what this means, honestly. But if you have a front yard, where else would this extra 5 feet be? It would be in the front yard. It wouldn't be in
Sure.
another part of the property.
I think the intention, though, is that we're not letting someone take advantage of that additional setback and then putting their outdoor dining in the rear.
But
So-
it's his front yard. I mean, that's the overall overarching requirement. I mean, unit this is in, cell it's in is for front yard.
It also may indicate that it would be used in the space that's adjacent to whatever frontage they have. We do have a circumstance where there was approval granted for a restaurant to have outdoor dining that is not adjacent to their particular restaurant because of the space and the allowance. So I think is a choo-choo that has that outdoor dining area that's just that's not right next to their space. And so in this way, we could still allow for a process like that, but it's instinctive in the code that's identifying that use of a space is directly contiguous to where they've cited their, their frontage.
Then can we use the word adjacent?
Instead of contiguous?
Yeah,
I just don't see.
sure.
that's anything for us.
We'll make the update. Okay.
At the end of the table, toward the end of the table, required driveway separation. For B1C, it says this requirement is not applicable in the B1TC subdistrict. If we go to our online code, it says B1C district. I'm not sure how that T got in there.
I had a question about the minimum interior side yard. Actually, there's two minimum interior, on page 56. There are two cells for minimum interior side yard, and they say for buildings up to 24 feet in height, there's none required. But if it's above 24 feet in height, you have to have a 25-foot interior side yard. I think this looks like it's coming from our existing code, but I don't understand why we would be requiring a 25-foot interior side yard. Doesn't make sense to me.
For what it's worth, I'd be fine eliminating the side yard requirements.
What does staff think of that? Or legal?
What did you say, Commissioner Hunnigan? I was trying to look at the code
sure.
and what's here and then versus this, and I'm thinking,
I said I would be fine with eliminating the side yard requirements.
I see. In the B1C district and in B1 TOD?
And the TOD.
Yes.
I'm looking at my
Okay.
booklet, and it is
Okay.
in our code, apparently. I don't understand
Yeah.
why.
Right, it probably has to do with the fact that, if a building is more than 2 stories and it's right up against the property next to it, it's creating kind of an imposing.
Right, but you go from 0 at
Right,
24
no, I
feet
know.
tall to if you're 25 feet tall, all of a sudden you have to have a 25-foot side yard. It just, maybe
Yeah.
we've actually never applied that.
Right, it's a fairly
Provision
significant
also.
side yard, obviously, but I'm just saying what I assume the purpose was.
And then I had a question on, there's note 2, if no one has anything before that. Note 2 says where a lot line abuts a railroad right-of-way, no buffer yard is required. And I don't know why that footnote is here, because this doesn't talk about buffer yards, I think. It doesn't talk about rear yards unless I missed something.
Do we have a rear yard setback requirement? I don't see one in the table for the B1 districts.
Do we just not have it for the B districts?
I mean, there's one in B2. I just don't know if we don't
Yeah.
have one in B1 or if we have one and it's just missing from the table.
I don't see, oh, yeah. So B1 district. It's 1097 is buffer yard. So A, it reads B1 district where an interior side lot line and/or rear lot line in the B1 district abuts a residential district or single or two-family residential use, an interior side or rear buffer yard is required in conformance with the following. And so then it says that a buffer yard shall be a minimum of 5 feet in width. And then it would apply the 6-foot screening in that buffer yard. So we do have one, but I think it is not called out separately in the table here.
Okay, thank you.
I'll just note too, going back to that required driveway separation, we made a correction in the B1C district about that TC, and the same language is used, I believe it should read in the B1 TOD that driveways in the B1 TOD the sub-district would still shall maintain a minimum 20-foot separation. So right now it reads TC in that column, so we
Yeah,
corrected
good
it.
catch.
So was there any sort of consensus on the interior side yard for buildings over 24?
Not yet.
Okay.
This is more of a rhetorical question, but we have a minimum lot area for residential, and it's always 1,800 square feet. But we are allowing buildings to be taller, an additional story. So if you have an additional story, theoretically, one would think that would allow more units, but then the developer, the proposer, is going to be restricted by the minimum lot area. So does that need to be investigated? The math won't work. You can add an extra, i.e., you can add an extra story, but you can't get any additional residential out of it if you start hitting that square feet per unit.
So we should ponder that, but I'm seeing another error. So it goes from minimum corner side yard, minimum interior side yard, and then it says minimum interior side yard again. That last one is supposed to be rear. The gremlin's gotten there. But back to Commissioner Marhol's question.
Is it the second occurrence?
Correct. Commissioner Marhol, are you suggesting that for 4-foot tall, 48-foot tall building, we want even larger side yards or rear yards?
I think I may have confused the issue. I jumped to a different topic, that being minimum lot area, and we may still have been on the side yard issue.
But I think you had a good point. If we're recommending changes in the maximum building height in these districts, should we consider changes to the required side and rear yards? That one standard we always consider, interfering with natural light and air.
I mean, I don't know. I think it depends. If I think about a business district or a city which has, you know, skyscrapers and buildings that have various businesses in them at different floors, they tend not to have massive side yards or any side yard whatsoever. So it might depend on the use of the building, whether it's for residential purposes or business purposes. At a minimum, that would be one consideration I would look at.
Yeah, I think, the side yard is less necessary places like in the downtown area and along Harlem. It's those transitional areas where it would be more necessary.
Where it abuts against the residential.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It may be self-defeating if we try and make more side yard be required for taller buildings, because you're giving up one thing for height. And so I'm not, as this building gets pushed in and narrower, I don't have it well thought out or well worded, but if we require a wider side yard for a taller building, then does the taller building become less
It's going to be less
usable?
dense. Yeah.
25 is pretty generous. too.
Going back to Commissioner Hennigan's thought, do we want to delete minimum yard requirements?
I cannot think of a compelling reason to keep it. So, yeah.
I agree with John.
Would this be suggested in all business districts, or just B1, just B2? What would be the suggestion?
I think the TOD definitely, if we're looking for more density.
Yeah, maybe not in the B1 TC. There is something in there already about the B1 TC having some kind of side yard setbacks, but yes, I think I agree, within the B1C and the B1 TOD, where it's not adjacent to a residential district, perhaps we should get rid of them.
I would agree, as long as it's not adjacent to the residential district.
What
Is that-
about rear yards, given that both B1C and proposed TOD do back up onto residential districts?
Is that where the buffer yard would come into play? Is that correct?
Yeah, where they would have an abutting property to those districts, yes.
So that's in 1097, you said? 1097 is where the
Yes.
rear buffer yards are?
Yes. I also found in our surveying of this chart, that footnote that Commissioner Miller had asked about the rail line area. I think there's probably one property down towards the edge of the southern border of the TOD proposed district that would apply to, where it would be abutting the rail line. So it's pretty minimal in that respect.
Has 1097 been changed at all? Did we approve it? Did we look at that in past months or not? Or is that?
I don't believe that particular section was, but I can get back to you.
Okay.
I'll look at our proposed edits and confirm.
So we're leaving, what are we doing?
Yeah, that was my question. Are we removing the side yard or rear yard requirements for the B1 TOD from the proposed? Is there any requirement?
Unless adjacent to residential, I believe yes. Remove.
Let's start with the rear yard.
Okay.
Try to make this easier. So again, many of these properties along Harlem back up to a residential district.
Not just many, just about all of
Yeah.
them.
Except we're along Burlington, right? I would not be in favor of getting rid of minimum rear yards.
I would
But
agree with
Can be
that.
talked out of that?
Do those properties now have rear yards? Or a lot of them are very old buildings, they probably don't have any rear yards?
I think it's more the latter.
Yeah. They're fairly shallow properties. So if we had rear yards, again, you would be really shrinking the size of the buildings.
Well, I don't know if any of the current buildings are over 24 feet.
That's true, yeah.
I'd have to think more about the
That's
buildings.
true.
I'd just like to add the requirement unless adjacent to residential, because that would cover the issue that you're talking about, I believe. If someone manages to assemble some properties,
Other thoughts?
So is there a rear yard requirement for the B1C district now? Or is it only B2 that has a rear yard requirement?
E1 does.
B1 does, okay.
So if it's under 24 feet, none is required. If it's above 24 feet, 25 feet is required.
Oh. Is that in the same table underneath interior side yard?
Yep.
Okay, 'cause
Right, so
my
minimum-
copy has 2 cells for minimum interior side yard, so one of those should say rear yard?
Right, she pointed
Yes.
out the second occurrence should say rear.
Okay, I guess I was not paying attention. Okay.
Other thoughts on,
I think adjacent to residential, there should always be a yard, regardless of the height, right? Maybe not 25 feet for a 24-foot building, but there should be some minimum rear yard required
Yeah,
if
that-
it's adjacent to a residential property.
Yeah, that buffer yard is only 5 feet, so it's not much.
Yeah.
Right.
No, we had talked in the past about if there's the alley there, that creates a separation and doesn't technically mean it's adjacent. So I just want
Yeah.
to be
We-
clear, you guys agree with that?
We could
dis-
say it immediately adjacent,
Okay.
or contiguous?
for sure, contiguous.
Couldn't resist. So for all of these, if these changes go through, a lot of these properties will not be conforming to the new rules. They'll just be existing
It would
non-conforming,
be legal non-conforming.
legal
correct?
non-conforming.
well, to Commissioner Peltier's point, do we really need 25 feet?
I mean, I don't have the expertise, I feel, to make these judgments. I think I would prefer to have some kind of a professional planner or something, sort of create perhaps a scale of if the building's 24 feet, it should be this much, 36 feet this much, and that kind of thing.
Right there.
Yeah. Todd, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, we can look into that. I think that, I mean, the 25 feet was part of the initial code, original code, I should say. But we can see what other towns have done and see if they do a scaling based on building height and take it from there. But yeah, it's a point well taken. I think it's 20 feet, 5 feet, kind of flat, like a flat height or a flat side yard or a yard requirement. Does seem a bit much, so scaling it by according to height does make sense. So we'll look into that.
To Commissioner Miller's point,
Thank you.
sorry, I overspoke. To Commissioner Miller's point, yes, we should get commentary from the professional planners and engineers, but ultimately we are deciding these values. And so I am not in support of simply deferring to the professional commentary necessarily. I think we get to take a fine-tooth comb to it and apply our values to it.
I have no problem with that, and if we were to do that, though, I'd also want to know things like, how wide are the property, how deep are the properties in the B1 Todd and things like that, things that we don't know right now, so we could make a judgment. Like if there's a property that's, 80 feet deep and we're asking them to have a 25-foot rear buffer yard, maybe that's not practical.
So I think getting more information about other communities with
Sure.
business districts, interior and rear yards
Okay,
would be helpful.
okay.
So I agree, I don't know that we know enough right now, but it's a good start to that discussion.
It's sparked some various ideas on my part to think about how we could appropriately scale and account for, light and other things, and, kind of getting at what you're hoping to see, probably. Okay, good discussion on that piece. We'll note this time in the meeting to make sure we take a close look at the discussion again. I will confirm that there aren't any proposed changes to 1097 currently. So we didn't discuss them prior but for today's discussion. Anything more on the Chapter 5 Business District use tables, except for our further exploration of those interior and rear yard, side yards?
Did we open up the discussion of the minimum lot area or not?
No, thank you, circling back.
And right now, just in case I didn't describe it well enough, right now, our code says 1,800 square feet, for B1 subdistricts, residential is 1,800 square feet of lot area per dwelling unit. So if we take a look at the parking lot we just spoke of, that would theoretically allow 2 units, regardless of height. So now we're changing our code to allow additional height, but you don't get any more units out of it. So ultimately, the height benefit that we've created is of no use to anyone. It lets you create taller, more stories, maybe nicer, but it certainly doesn't create more residential density.
We do have a lower requirement in the B2 district of 1,360 square feet, which if we're looking for a number, that would be one we might consider matching just for consistency.
Yes, I think the same thing applies, though. If we're going to allow more height, then I think the minimum lot area needs to be looked at as well.
That seems to make sense.
And maybe for B1, the magic number is 1360. And this is where certainly a professional survey of what other people do, other villages do, is acceptable. But I think it needs a look at a minimum.
Perhaps knowing the density of some existing buildings in town would be helpful. That helps me always get a good visual of what we're really talking about.
Certainly.
Would it help, and I haven't thought this through, so we have non-residential, we have residential. Would adding a third category of mixed use help at all?
We probably should, because otherwise the table doesn't work, because it doesn't account for that mixed the developer would be forced to go to staff for an interpretation.
Todd, are you familiar with any codes that break things down that way?
I can double check. I think the one that I'm most familiar with that might have updated recently is Algonquin, just because of their riverfront, their work on the riverfront. But I'll have to take a look. Not off the top of my head, but I wrote down that it's something to.
Okay, thanks. Anything else? Okay, what should we tackle next?
Okay, we've got chapter 6, I think will be maybe an easy one, depends on how controversial adding the term internet to our code might be. But on the memo, it was intended to include our, the couple of pages of chapter 6 and the page to be found. So it's 10.6.2 is adding the term to home occupations, 10.6.2D, I guess. Business shall be conducted primarily via fax, mail, telephone, internet, and/or computer equipment. So, any concerns there? Okay.
I think it's here to stay.
All right, good.
It's fine. I'm not sure how you get internet without computer equipment, but that's okay.
Somebody's a very serious author, maybe. Okay. The next one is discussing offices. So there's just some clarifications there. We're removing the term professional from offices. Just an unnecessary addition of the word there. It does specify the ground floor uses in the district, and it specifies that ground floor offices in the B2 district would be approved as a special use, and upper story offices shall be permitted uses in accordance with section 1054C4. So it's reflective of changes we made in chart prior. Okay. We removed the term cafe and replaced it with dining for when we're talking about outdoor eating establishments and eating activities. And then talk about, sorry. (10.6.3)(C) talks about, 10.6.2H is adding language regarding the use of permeable paving materials. So that's page 63 of that kind of additional pages. That's the easiest way to find it. And the only addition to the existing text says that all private yards must be landscaped with turf, ground cover, shrubs, trees, or other landscape improvements, such as walkways and patios, including the use of permeable paving materials. So whatever we land on as far as what we're considering permeable pavers would be included as a type of surface. The other changes in this section pertain to pages 74 and 75. We specify about Christmas tree sales lots, that Christmas tree sales lots shall be permitted in any non-residential zoning district. So currently, we don't have that. It just talks about the sales lots complying with requirements of our municipal code. So this specifies they can take place in business districts, essentially. Further on in that same section, we talk about house, apartment, garage, and yard sales, and also clarify that they can be held in any zoning district. So it just is specifying, clarifying where it did not clarify or give guidance before. Street and sidewalk sales would be permitted only in non-residential zoning districts. So we're specifying that change. That's 1063C5. 1063C6 talks about, oh, I'm sorry, that was what it was. And then the last section, or last change in this section is 1063C8, talking about rental kiosks, and that they would be permitted in any zoning district. Typically, we see such a thing in a lot in probably more the business or commercial districts, but if a rental kiosk might be considered for bikes, kayaks, canoes, that type of use would be permitted elsewhere.
I was wondering, do we need any provision for temporary dining uses? There isn't one now in the code. Is that something that we've had a need for in the past?
So my recollection is there's a catch-all in the temporary use section for ones not specifically called out, and as long as they're approved by the board, so that's usually how we bring the temporary dining.
Okay. All of these temporary uses have to be approved? Or can they
Well,
just
like
be
the
done?
Christmas tree lots and stuff can be approved administratively if they meet the requirements, but if they're not specifically called out in the temporary uses, then they
Then the
need
board needs to
approval.
require it with a special event permit or something like that?
Yeah, it's more general than that in terms of it can be for 3 months, 6 months,
Okay.
whatever. So the outdoor dining season, for instance.
As long as administratively, we don't want to include something like that to make things easier. I was just raising the issue.
Yeah.
I think there's processes in place currently to allow for the temporary dining. So annual renewal of outdoor dining permits that would go through the village board the first time, and then beyond that would be permitted by staff administratively, or farmers market, where we have other processes by regulating the activities at the farmers market, where people would eat food and consume it.
Yeah, so I think for the outdoor dining, once they have a plan and it's approved by the board, we've built in that they can renew it as long as they don't have any changes administratively in future years.
Okay. 10.5.6.
Anything
Okay.
else for chapter 6?
Okay. So the last big section that we have to tackle is about parking. There's a couple of different sections here that we've included. One of these was pasted in. The first thing to be addressed is 10.8.9, talking about required off-street parking spaces, and the specific addition to that passage is included in the memo. The addition just reads for the benefit of the public. It says, in certain cases, parking requirements within a proximity of a transit facility, so we're talking about a train station, a bus stop. This specifies typically a half-mile walk to a train station and a quarter-mile walk to a bus stop may be reduced as the transit-served area is accessed increasingly more by pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit riders, and less so by motorists. As a result, parking reductions that account for transit-oriented uses within the B2 district and B1 TOD district, as well as the B1C and B1 TC to certain extents, are reflected in Table 8. So there is, I wanted to check and see. I believe the table is included in the newest version of the memo, but essentially it halves the required parking in that TOD district. So, and to some extent, the B1 TC district. So where you would have, for example, a multifamily dwelling, instead of having 2 per dwelling unit required parking spaces, they would be allowed 1 parking space per dwelling unit. And it kind of goes on from there. Dwellings above the ground floor, same, goes from 2 to 1. A townhouse, if we want to call out specifically, it would go from 2 per dwelling unit to 1 per dwelling unit. Independent living, just that name has been changed from independent elderly housing to reflect our current language of independent living, and that requirement for 1 per unit hasn't changed. The ones in the TOD are very similar to or match that of the B1 TC district. So it's half of a space for an assisted living facility and 1 required for each of those type of dwelling units in the other categories. Non-residential uses matches that of the existing B1 TC district parking standards. So that, open for your comments on that particular section.
Table is on page 120 of the memo,
Thank you.
or starts. No comments? Thinking? So the requirements were not changed for the B1C because they were going to be too far from transit, right? Okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I very excitedly jumped into that section. I wanted to premise this whole chapter 8. It starts with a general provision change, and it says, well, the primary focus of these provisions relate to car parking. They also apply to the parking or storage of bicycles. So we would like to incorporate bicycle parking and continued focus on those amenities for people who are using bicycles, either for pleasure or for commuting, and that type of requirement would be reflected throughout this particular section of the code.
I guess I had just a question on the residential parking requirements, which is really not what we're talking about here, but looking at the table, how do we, when we say that we want like 2 parking spaces for a residence, what does that mean exactly? Does it mean in a garage or in the driveway or?
So typically we're talking about, well, likely it would be, in these instances, you're probably talking about a parking lot of some kind, small or not. a driveway, we typically, in any residential district, we like to see at least probably space for 2 vehicles to be stored off of the right-of-way, either in a garage or otherwise. In the lots themselves, we would count that, say it's brand new, we would say, okay, your building is housing 6 units. You have 6 units of rental property. And so you'd be technically, by the code, currently required to have 12 parking spaces to suit that particular property. And so by doing this within that proximity, you would allow, 6 spaces as a minimum. They could exceed that, but that would be the minimum required. And, it's an interesting flex, I guess, between the balance of parking and potentially those buffer areas where you have, by a reduction of required parking, the ability potentially to open up additional green space. It's been my experience in other development discussions with residential properties, multifamily residential properties.
So do we, the footnote 1 would seem to suggest that you could have, for a single-family home or a duplex, you could have a reduced parking requirement there too. Is that, as long as it's in a transit-oriented area, which is a half a mile of a train station, is that something that's of concern to anyone? Does anyone see that as an issue of concern, or?
Well, the charts themselves don't really address, they talk about residential districts, but a single family, on page 119 of that same table, those requirements aren't, oh, I see what you mean. So
I'm talking
in
about
those particular zoning districts with a
Yes, if it's a
single-family property.
residentially zoned district in a transit-oriented development, half mile. It's probably not, I just thought it seemed strange the way that was, it didn't carve out, say, single-family homes or anything. It just says a reduced parking requirement of 1 space per dwelling unit is acceptable anywhere in a transit area. That's all.
Would that just apply to existing single-family homes, though? Because you can't build a new single-family home in the TOD district, correct?
I would think that's a non-conforming use of that particular district. So we don't encounter that frequently. I think there are a handful of them. I know there's one close to downtown that's in the B2 district, but it wouldn't be, I guess we'd have to address it on a case-by-case basis. But this is the minimum requirement where if they,
But
would have
if you look
more.
at table 8, it says residential districts, and then you drop down, and it says dwelling, and then it says multifamily, single-family, townhouse, two-family. They all have footnote 1 superscript. So that footnote 1 applies to residential districts, not just to the TOD.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's an issue or not, but I don't know if people had thought that through.
So would you just recommend removing that particular footnote for that type of use that might be situated near a transit stop?
I don't know. Maybe. I don't know if we want to necessarily reduce single-family parking I don't know.
Right.
Maybe we do. It's just that has that impact, and I don't know if anyone had thought about it.
I see.
I don't know that we need that footnote there at all, because it is just talking about residential districts,
Right.
not uses. So I don't think that footnote should apply in the residential districts. Keep it in the commercial, though.
I might be reading this completely wrong, so just indulge me. At page 119, dwelling, let's just say single family as an example. Does that, where are we talking about? All over Riverside, the entire community? Or is this just speaking to a specific district?
I would say if it's in a, I would say it would be any type of residential district, so,
Okay.
because it doesn't specify. So
Right.
I would read it as
All
R
over.
1A, R
Yeah, it doesn't
2A,
matter.
R 2, 3, 4.
So then
And-
the footnote does make sense.
Right, so
when
if
you
you're
look at it
in
like that.
R4 on that stretch
Mm-hmm.
north of, you know, the B1 TOD, then that may very well be appropriate. In areas, you know, farther to the center of town, less so, but it also would apply less frequently to be concerned about.
So to use the single family as an example, if you live
Right,
on, you know, on Shenstone, outside of the TOD, outside of any of these, you're supposed to have two. But if you live in in the TOD or any of the other ones identified here, then you can go down, it just cuts it to one
Yeah.
parking space. So yes, I think that
Yeah.
footnote does make sense then. I
Okay.
mean, it's maybe not the most elegant way to do it, but I think it gets the point across, although,
But the footnote applies to transit-oriented areas, not TODs. It's not the new TOD, it's transit-oriented areas, which are within a quarter mile of a bus stop or a
Yeah.
half mile of the train station. Okay.
but it also includes its TOD districts, so.
are we okay keeping it as it is then? Okay. All right. Backing up just a little bit. Is there anything going from 109 to, in that first section, 10.8.1, about our general provisions of off-street parking, or possibly 10.8.2, when we're computing parking requirements? The only change in that section is calling out parking specifically designated for bicycles is also included in that parking space computations.
I have a couple questions on page 112. So at the bottom there, E3. How does one interpret that? The all developments shall part of it. Is it all residential developments? Is it residential and business?
Well, farther up in the code, in E, kind of describing before it hits the numbered section, it says new developments in business districts. So I mean, I guess it would be specific to those. I'm really probably saying something obvious. I apologize. Let's see. We require, because we,
So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 apply to new developments in business districts only.
that's how I would read it, from kind of top to bottom. That's how I would interpret it. It also says, you know, in addition, the village may require parking facilities for bicycles on non-residential properties, and I suppose that the inclusion of that one or two family residential developments confuses that number 3, because to me it would kind of keep to that flow of within the zoning district, these would be required and these are your parameters for that requirement.
In paragraph E, I don't know if we're, okay. The red line part of paragraph E, which says new developments in business district shall require, just the fact that it says new developments, I don't know what that means, number one. And should it say, if we're talking about after 2022, should it have some kind of a reference, I don't know, a date reference in the code to make it easier for people to understand? And I mean, what is it? Maybe that's not necessary, but I just don't like those kinds of, that kind of word.
Would it be preferable to, I don't want to expand this if it doesn't need to be expanded that much, but if there was something, like you said, a qualifier to identify what's considered, is it a brand new development from new construction?
Yes.
Or is it a remodel
A reuse,
that's of
right, or a
significant, is it upon transfer of property to a new
Yes.
owner, this would be required? Like, what would those parameters be that could encourage this use without making it something that people would need to incorporate immediately, for existing properties? So what do you?
Todd, did you have something specific in mind by new development?
I mean, I guess I wasn't as thrown off by just the term new development, but I guess hearing it expressed here, I mean, I guess there is, you could qualify it with a date, or say new construction, but then what if it's an add-on? I think the general idea, just kind of removing it just from the term new development, is just to encourage the inclusion of adding bicycle parking anytime development is occurring. So yeah, I guess I could see where we need to clarify whether we say the term new development and add the qualifier of a certain date, or not use the term new development and use a different term. But I think the underlying thing that we want to get across is that we just want to encourage more bicycle parking whenever development is occurring. So maybe that's probably something that we need to, my team will revisit and see if it's how we can clarify that further, where that's the main point and not necessarily that the new development. We don't want people to get hung up on that term. I think it's more just about adding more bike parking when development is occurring. So we'll revisit that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
This says new developments shall be required, number one. And then if you continue into the next sentence, I'm not clear if this is how the village could impose this. It says, in addition, the village may require parking facilities for bicycles on non-residential properties. May require parking facilities for bicycles on non-residential properties to provide for a more, how would the village, under what circumstances, maybe this is a question for Attorney Mars, could the village possibly, in some situations, require bike parking for some non-residential uses, but maybe in others not? I mean, would that be some?
Right, there,
How does that
I think
happen?
there needs to be something in the way of parameters and standards in order for this to be implemented.
And in
fairly.
in the existing paragraph, it already encourages, I think. I just don't know if this is a bit overdone, this new red line section, if it could be simplified, as well as specify what a new development is.
Yeah, that entire sentence that starts with "in addition," it's sort of helpful for context, but it doesn't really state a requirement there. It's just that we may do this. So I think if we would we could consider eliminating that entire sentence and just going from new developments shall be required to provide bicycle parking spaces, and then when such facilities are required, here's the calculation.
Right. I mean, the existing text says, therefore, it is encouraged that private property owners provide facilities for these modes of transportation, which are earlier said to be bicycles and motorcycles. So I don't know if we need all that extra, all those extra words, plus it may be having some inconsistent application when it says may require.
I think it's, the language is really somewhat reflective of a different style of application of the code. So in some communities where you have a design review or you have other types of administrative approvals that can take place, then in those cases, we would be able to, by the way this is written, to require this as part of a review. But the fact that we go through site plan, for example, or we go through other permitting processes, we have kind of the ability to set specific guidelines and apply them.
So this perhaps is like a heads up to people who are going to redevelop, like, hey, we might require this, so be ready for it.
But then the sentence prior says that we are going to do it. So, from a staff perspective, I'm okay with removing the in addition sentence that kind of is reflective of the other goals of the code. And then you have the set guidelines for applying those standards, if that's okay with the commission.
Yes, I think we can address the issue of the interpretation of the word new developments by simply going back to the beginning of 10.8-3, which has some requirements where site plan review is required, and it defines what construction is and when and what construction is not. Essentially, new stuff versus just maintenance activities. And so I think the sentence could be revised to say, when site plan review is required, developments in business districts shall be. Because that then refers back to basically what brings us to this in the first place, is site plan review. And that definition for 10.8-3 is on page 111 of the document, top of the page.
So, perseverating, under E, on page 112, sorry. Number 1, non-residential developments have a ratio of car to bike parking 10-1. Then you go to 3, and it says, except for 1 or 2 family residential developments, all developments shall have no less than 3 bicycle parking spaces. Those seemed odd. I think that's why I asked what 3 meant to everybody.
It seems like 3 should be a sentence that goes with 1, so that you have this 1-to-10 ratio, but it's got parameters to it. So if you have, you always have to have a minimum of 3, but you can't be required to have more than 10. But in between that, you need 1 space for every 10 parking spaces. Does that then help it work better?
No, because then what if you only have parking spaces for 4 cars, you're required to have 3 bike spaces?
Then you have, yes. Then you
That would
have
be
to-
nuts, though.
That is nuts.
I mean, I'm sorry, that's not right, I don't mean that to you, but that would be, but I mean, if the idea is to do a 10-to-1 ratio, and then to say, well, except when you don't have a 10 to, I mean, one would think if you're trying to encourage more biking, you'd have a higher ratio there, and, like a 10 to 5 ratio. I mean, just wouldn't make sense for you to have a 10-to-1 ratio here, and then for a building that has only 4 spaces, to require 3 bike spaces.
Well, then you could make the minimum 2 spaces. But I think that's the point of number 3, is just to provide some parameters to how many bike spaces you need to provide. You have a minimum and a maximum, and in between it gets to be ratioed.
But for a one-family residential development, you need 3 bike spaces?
No, because you still have
No, it
the
says except for.
non-residential
Oh, okay.
development requirement. This only applies to non-residential, the ratio and the caps. Parameters, excuse me.
I mean, I'd be fine striking 3 and just leaving 1. I mean, because I can see no reason why some of those smaller stores, and I know this is only for I think it's only for new developments, but some of the smaller stores, if they were, redone, but they're still relatively small, which is probably going to be the case, where are they going to have room to put 3 bike? What if they don't have parking, or they're not going to have room to put 3 bike spaces there? So I'd be fine losing this.
Well, would you want to cap number 1 at no more than 10, more than 10 is not required?
What do you mean?
I'm not sure you need the cap anyway, because at a 1-to-10 ratio, you'd have to have 100 parking spaces to force you into
Yeah.
10 bike spaces, and I'm not sure where we're going to find. That's a lot of pavement that we're really not,
The proposed Harlem lot only has, 27 or so spaces?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm all for dreaming big on that, but if someone really gets to that, they could always ask for a variation to reduce the number of bike spaces.
It would have probably come to us as a PUD anyway.
Exactly.
My last question for me in this section, nope, I lied, I have 2 questions. So on page 113, number 7, the end of it says, shall be submitted for village review and approval. Do we want to specify what unit of village is reviewing and approving?
Yes.
And could we just make it part of the site plan review? So it's at PZC? We want staff allowed to do it?
This is really just about the locking mechanism?
do we even really need that?
The aesthetics.
Sorry, Chairperson Mateo. Do we even need this locking requirement? I mean, everyone who rides a bike should have a lock. I can't imagine that us providing a locking facility at newly constructed developments that required a site plan review really needs to have this special, we provide locks for you element.
Todd, I remember I think I remember us talking about this during our steering committees.
Yeah, as trustee Paul actually brought it up, and actually the code, the standard actually reads that the lock needs to be supplied by the user. They just need a way to latch their user supplied lock to the bike, whether it's a bike rack or just a way to attach it to something, because you don't want people attaching it to a signpost or a fence, and so on. You want it to be something to attach their lock to. So I think that's the basis of this bullet point 7. was to provide that and provide more clarity as to what that means. And I do agree to the earlier point of clarifying that it should be part of site plan review, just for clarification purposes.
So it's a bike rack,
Which is identified in
right?
number.
I mean, that's what we're talking about here. We're talking
So
about
the
a
word
bike rack.
locking mechanism are probably inappropriate.
Yeah, I thought,
It's just a rod. I mean,
I guess I would say I still contend delete number 7 because I cannot imagine there are any commercially available bike parking lots that don't allow provision of locks.
yeah, it's-
I can't imagine that's even possible.
You're saying to streamline the requirement, so if someone's building a bicycle
Yes.
facility, they don't have to have a paragraph in their application explaining how they have a locking mechanism.
Just provide
bike
a
rack.
standard commercially available bike rack.
If the idea is to ensure that the type or style of the bike rack that's installed is able to secure the frame of the bike to it with the user-provided lock, I think that's kind of what I would think about, and saying, we don't want them attaching it to a sign or a parking meter or whatever loop that might be available to something that's not conducive to attaching the main frame of the bike. So, if we
Right.
specify that, then just the general design of the bike rack installed has to be, able to do that. It's not like you're attaching it, you can only attach a handlebar to it or something. I don't know what kind of like
Again,
that would be.
bike
But-
locks and bike parking are
Yeah.
pretty standard across,
Yeah.
honestly, the country. So anything commercially available has to work. Unless we know of something that doesn't work.
I support striking paragraph 7. It's also introducing a new term, which is bicycle parking facility. And paragraph 6 just calls it a bicycle parking rack, so it just seems overly verbose,
yeah.
I think we should provide a definition of a bicycle parking space that includes a rack. I mean, that's basically what we're saying is
You can't just
Do
make a
that.
rectangle on the
correct.
parking lot.
It's exactly.
Yeah, that would make a lot of
It has to be a rack
sense.
that allows the user to lock their bike to it and needs to be whatever, 15 square feet.
That's a good idea.
Okay, so we're striking this 7? Is that the agreement was? Okay, thank you.
Yeah. But we're combining the definition into one.
Okay. Did that address both of your questions, Chair Mateo? Or was there one more?
Right, so we're not requiring space for moped or motorcycle parking, correct? You can have it, but it's not required, unlike new developments are required to add bike parking. Is that right, Todd?
Correct. I think the way it's marked in 8 and 9 on page 113, I guess 9 says may, so it's not a requirement. And then 8, motorcycle parking shall be located near. Do we not want to require is that what you're asking for? Bullet point 8 on page 113 is to not require motorcycle parking?
My question, so it says it shall be located near the main entrance, but we haven't specified how much motorcycle or moped parking is made available in new developments. Is that right?
Oh, like a ratio? Is that what you're asking? Kind of like
Right.
bike parking is 1 to 10.
If we weren't to require it, then we could just modify the language here to say, motorcycle parking, if provided, shall be located here, so that they can determine whether they have a lot of people with motorcycles renting property there or attending whatever it is they do there.
Does anybody want to require minimum numbers of motorcycle or moped parking?
No.
Okay, so I like that, if provided,
Okay.
shall. That's all I have for this section.
Okay. Let's see. In 10.8.5, there's the inclusion, the current code calls out specific requirements for B2 district and B1 district, but with the addition of B1 TOD incorporates new parking standards for that area of town. So we talk about the encroachments on the side and rear yards. And it all very closely matches the existing language for B1 district. So there, even though it's a separate overlay district, it will still be reflective of what it is now.
So I had a comment on this, that subparagraph 3, which I know is a repeat, that in B1 TC and now in B1 TOD, you can park in the front yard, in front or in front of a building. I don't know if I like that. I mean, number one, I can't really imagine parking in front of a building in the B1 TC or the B1 TOD. I can't think of a situation where that exists now. And I don't know if we want to allow parking in front of a building in either situation.
Well, it says by special use only, so.
Well, I know, but even then, why would we, I mean, you're right, it's fine, we don't have to do anything. It just seems odd to me why we would ever want.
Well, we do,
The dentist.
but the dentist really isn't in B1 TOD, but certainly in front of the new restaurant that replaced Riverside Restaurant, that's parking in front of the building.
I guess so.
A gas,
Yeah, I
a
guess
gas
you're right.
station may have the
Yeah.
building pushed back.
I think
Okay, maybe you're
I
right.
understand
was
your
thinking more-
goals.
I guess I
but-
was thinking more of like the downtown area or something like that. Why would we ever allow parking like in front of Michael's Pancake House or something like that? But maybe, maybe you're right, it's a useless comment.
Not
Not useless, I mean, it's not
useless.
not something we should spend our time on.
I have a question about the, on page 114. I may be brain dead and missing something, but we have the double-loaded module. The width DL is 40 feet. And that 40 feet includes 2 parking spaces and the drive aisle.
You're correct. The numbers are off.
But I
So we
think
just
that's for
need to
parallel
check.
parking, isn't it? Isn't that for parallel?
No,
It's
this is-
0
it's a-
degrees. It's for 0-degree parking.
Which is
Angle.
perpendicular. No?
No, that's 90.
Oh, okay. See, I am brain dead.
No, when we were considering that
Okay.
matter earlier, yesterday when I was looking at it, I made the same mistake, but 0 must be perpendicular.
Okay. So we have the opportunity to change that to 22. if we want to
You're
think
right.
about that.
We could.
And I think it's, to me, it's worthwhile. I think 24 is not necessary for a
It's-
90-degree
It
parking.
comes from a car-centric engineering philosophy.
Could certainly say 22 to 24, or,
Well, this is
Yeah,
just
like,
minimum.
This is minimum, yeah, so if they
Yeah.
want to do 24, I mean, and some, some uses would. Some uses want to
Yeah,
give that
so-
extra. Some uses want to give a little extra width on the parking spot. But I think for a minimum, we might consider 22.
Are these minimums, or is it this is what it shall be? Because it doesn't say minimum.
That I would say, based on the title of the table, is the requirements, is that would be the minimum requirement.
Right. I agree.
It has to be minimums, otherwise we are very specifically designing a parking lot for someone.
Which we tend to do.
We do, but alternatively, are these maximums? I mean, that's kind of a combative statement, and I don't intend it that way, but that's what someone could potentially say. These are just maximums.
Well, you have to meet this requirement.
We could
And you're
add,
right,
We
we
can
could,
call it a minimum.
someone could say, oh, I can't provide a wider aisle because.
we could add the word minimum to the
Minimum
table name.
yes.
Yes. that would
Minimum
help.
off-street parking requirements.
That would prevent the combative proposer.
So if I think of driving on some streets, not so much in Riverside, but in nearby towns, that have parking on both sides of the road, and then you have supposedly 2 passing lanes that people can go at speed, at 20 or 25 miles an hour, how wide is that space typically? Because is this even wider? Is 24 feet even wider than that, or is that as wide? So
I think it depends on.
It depends on the village, yes.
But in general, let's say you're
Drive lanes, it can be as low as 10 feet.
well, that's what it's like, so is this over-engineered at 24 feet? Like, if I'm driving
Yes.
down Addison, I cross Harlem, and I go into Berwyn right there, and all of a sudden, there's parking on both sides of the street, and it's super narrow, and there are people really can't,
You're doing this.
yes, you have to stop. So that's a suggestion of, do we really need that over-engineered standard in the
Traffic,
parking lot?
you're correct, and Commissioner Peltier and I have been exposed to, street design does allow for things less than the standard 12 feet. Like I said, the standard 12 feet is for a very car-centric approach. Interstates are designed at 12-foot lanes, so you can go 75 miles an hour. Residential streets do not require that level of speed or width. I don't have the references in front of me, but I can do some research and get them to us fairly quickly.
So do we all want to consider reducing the minimum aisle width from 24 to something else?
I would say not less than 22, only because part of it is not just the, passing, but the maneuvering.
Correct.
So I'm not sure what, like a parking garage, I personally have a hard time parking in parking garages, so. But it would be interesting to see what those dimensions are. We certainly won't want to go that low.
Yeah, like some parking garages in Chicago, which are incredibly narrow and can barely get your car in or out.
Exactly.
That's got to be less than 24 feet.
But you do.
But you do, yes.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
There's certainly a science to a lot of the parking dimensions, the aisle widths, the lane widths as you drive down residential streets or collector streets or whatever the case is. So certainly there's absolutely design standards that apply to those things. And as you narrow those streets, then people hopefully tend to drive slower. And so in areas where you're encouraging that pedestrian or bicycle activity, having less wide streets is, somewhat helpful. At the same time, I have to think of the other side of the coin and say, what can fire engines and other public safety vehicles and large vehicles that need to get through for utility purposes, how do they maneuver around those particular areas? And so that's kind of the other side of the engineering coin, I think.
So that could be another consideration,
Well,
is what's the
yeah.
required fire lane? Usually those are
The,
separately.
the answer is in front of us because the minimum aisle width is 18 feet. So we know that 18 feet will support just about anything.
Yeah.
That's true, yeah.
Okay, so we would be, up for a discussion based on feedback from an engineer as to whether 22 feet minimum would be acceptable for parking lot with drive aisles. Yes?
Again,
Okay.
it's, the engineer, depending on their philosophy, may be more car-centric.
Okay.
So it's advice.
Okay. We were okay then with 10.8.5, that location of off-street parking. We just talked about the TOD and including those. 10.8.8 incorporates this B1 TOD district label. it's text that provides context for what we're trying to do with parking flexibility in those districts. It essentially mirrors what's already in the B2 district.
For 10.8.8, do we really want to say the level of parking needed, or do we want to say something more along the lines of quantity? So we don't have a debate about what the meaning of level is.
Be a better word, yes. Intensity?
Intensity would work.
Intensity?
I'd prefer quantity.
Hmm?
I think it's
Okay.
just a little clearer.
Okay. Okay. Anything else in that same section? No? Okay. We already talked about 10.8.9, the charts. And that brings us to two fairly changed sections. 10.8.10 is a brand new section on electric vehicle charging stations.
And this hasn't been updated after our conversation about it. We discussed it 2 or 3 meetings ago and had a lot of
Yes.
issues with it.
Yes.
So I imagine those issues are still there.
Can we add those edits to this? Because I was already starting to notice things.
Have at it.
You wanna-
No, I meant go back to what our previous discussion was, because I think we already beat it down enough.
Yeah.
Okay. So note whatever was requested at that time, make the changes, and come back.
Please.
Great. Okay. It's not really the very, very last thing because we will now have to return to some things. But 10.8.11 is renamed from 10.8.10 because we incorporated the other. This is off-street loading spaces. So talking about loading zones and areas, types of materials, and limitations on the use of those spaces.
Can we ask the consultant to explain the numbers in G? Where did those come from? I'm trying to imagine 150,000 square foot non-residential use.
Yeah, I'm taking a look at that right now just to refresh myself.
To help you, this may just be an industry standard. I have no idea.
It's generally from best practice from the research that we've done. I can't off the top of my head remember which community that we used as the best practice, but in general, it is kind of industry standard. It may vary a bit, but unless we do exhaustive research, this is probably as close to standard as you could probably get, at least in the Chicago region.
That's fine. I have no questions. I was just curious. Or, sorry, no objections.
Anything else in that section? Okay.
Okay, thank you.
I actually,
Yeah.
at the risk of everyone hating me, I'd like to just quickly revisit the bicycle section, because what's bothering me is if we delete, and I'm on page 113, if we delete paragraph 7, we're effectively not requiring any bicycle racks. That's my concern.
But I think we were going to add to the definition of bicycle parking.
To
It
include
means
racks.
a rack.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because another way to address this also is if we take paragraph 6, which says bicycle parking racks may be mounted, we can say shall be mounted to the ground. But either way would work. I just want to make sure that there's going to be not just
A rack.
parking spots for bicycles, but actual racks to attach the bicycles, otherwise people won't use them. Or people won't want to just have their bikes loose.
Okay, I think it's
It was
clear.
really bothering me. Thank you very much.
It's good.
Okay, well, thank you so much for all of this, hours and hours of review and thoughtful discussion, and we have lots of work to do yet, but we will likely set another public hearing for additional changes that we've been pretty confident in making. We'll revise the current text into an ordinance with text amendments proposed, so you can take a look at it and hopefully get through a lot of this. And that'll be a long review as well, I'm sorry to say, but thank you.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
It's early. Is there anything else we can talk about?
Do we want to
No.
forge ahead? No? And delay our discussion of impervious surface calculation until another meeting?
I'm okay with that.
I think we got some good feedback from earlier too as well that we can incorporate into additional considerations for you next time.
Okay. Well, thank you, Todd. Our next meeting is June 22nd. I'm sure it's on everybody's calendar already, but as usual, if you know you can't make it, let us know. And is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Oh,
I second the motion.
okay. Call the roll, please.
Commissioner Morville,
Aye.
Commissioner Miller,
Aye.
Commissioner Pelletier,
Aye.
Commissioner Hennigan,
Aye.
Commissioner Matthews.
Aye.
Commissioner Brown.
Aye.
And Chairperson Mateo.
Yes, please. Motion carries. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.